Hey, we going? Yeah. All right. How's it going? How's it going? Hopefully someone tunes in. Hey, I suppose I should introduce myself a little bit first before I get into talking about the subject today, which is going to be Passion of the Christ, the movie by Mel Gibson. Um, I don't know, what can I say about myself? I'm just a guy, a regular average Joe. I kind of got very interested in cinema um, when I was a teenager, and then that kind of broadened out into an interest in visual culture and that as a methodology of processing and understanding the world. But I don't have any special knowledge or qualifications or anything like that. But a few months ago, as the 20th anniversary of this movie, Passion of the Christ, was coming up or was looming. This was in February because it was released a little bit early to capitalize on Easter, way back in 2004. Um, I wrote an article kind of talking a lot about the film in retrospect and some of the misunderstandings that people have about the film. And apparently it touched a nerve a little bit, and it couldn't be released. Couldn't be released. I got censored. I got cancelled. No, I mean it did kind of get censored um, for various reasons. Maybe they'll become clear. Um, but anyway, as time ticked on, I thought, why don't I just kind of release this online in the most unconfined, unhinged, sort of loose way possible. And that's what this is. So hopefully you get something out of it. But so the Passion of the Christ. Um, this was obviously a seminal film, both in terms of um, religious culture, um, conservative Christianity, and particularly the conservative um, media ecosystem splintering off from the mainstream at the time. Ahmed White kind of wrote an article, an interesting article about this back in the day, talking about 2004 as sort of the divergent year in the culture. I think it was called 2004, the year that culture broke. So anyway, this was kind of in the midst of um, the height of new atheism, the war on terror, the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan a few years after 9/11. Um, uh, it's at the same time as Michael Moore was at the height of his kind of fame. So it's really a um, coming together or a fracturing point, depending on how you want to look at it in the culture. And here's what I kind of said about it a few months ago. So as Mel Gibson, Mel Gibson, he becomes this huge star in the late 70s into the early to mid 80s. He's got Mad Max, and then, I think in 1985 he was voted the hottest man in Hollywood or maybe the world. He was just taking off. He was becoming, I think he's been referred to as the crown prince of Hollywood. Maybe I think that's an Ebert quote. But anyway, he was having this immense rise to the level of high stardom during the 1980s, but he was also becoming increasingly self destructive. By kind of like the peak of his fame, which is around maybe 1990, the Lethal Weapon movies and all that stuff, he was also at this personal nadir where he was engaging in violence and self destructive and addictive behavior, and he was reportedly a nightmare to work with. In fact, I've heard something to that effect from one of the filmmakers who worked with him at that time, saying that he was the worst actor they'd ever had to work with, and that, was addiction and sexual impropriety and just totally off the rails type of behavior. But, as he was reaching this peak of his fame, he was at a personal nadir. And like so many others in these kind of situations, at his lowest point, he embraced the redemptive message of the Christianity that he was raised in. And, you know, he was raised in a highly conservative Christian family. His father was this prominent or semi-prominent sedevacantist, Catholic dissenter to the post-Vatican II Catholic system. Uh, he's a really eccentric and weird man in his own right. He lived to more than 100 years old. But anyway, so like many people in that situation where you've hit a personal low, he kind of returned to the faith that he was raised in with the zeal of the convert, basically. Turned his life around. And this sort of um, Hail Mary, sort of coming to Jesus moment, planted the seed that would eventually germinate into the Passion of the Christ, which was a passion project, no pun intended, that he spent a decade trying to get produced, only to be met with institutional rejection and unanimously discouraging advice from like producers. All these, you know, behind the scenes men told him this film would never work, it could never be made, it could never make any money. Um, it was guaranteed to be a disaster or whatever. That's what everyone told him. And there are numerous interviews where he talks about this, about how frustrating it was for him to, have such belief in this project, because it was a religious commitment for him. Um, it was something deeper than just mere money. But anyway, so the premise of the Passion of the Christ is that it's going to dramatize the harrowing final 12 hours in the life of Jesus, beginning with his moment in the Garden of Gethsemane, um, where he sweats blood, through the betrayal by Judas, his arrest, trial, torture, and ultimate crucifixion, interspersed with, the other iconic scenes from the life of Christ, like the Last Supper and the Sermon on the Mount. And it would be all entirely in Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, and Latin, obviously the language of the Roman Empire. And so eventually, after years of this institutional rejection, Gibson self-funded, produced, and directed the project through his company Icon Productions, which is a fairly interesting production company that did some cool stuff over the years. But yeah, so as I kind of mentioned, it arrived in 2004 at the height of new atheism and the Iraq War, and so its release and promotional cycle became like truly chaotic in its own right. There was a lot of criticism of Mel Gibson himself because he kind of implied and maybe even flat out claimed inspiration from the Holy Spirit, then subsequently gave a series of eccentric interviews that were a little too unfiltered for TV audiences at the time. Passion of the Christ quickly became heavily conservative coded, and like the films of Michael Moore, who I mentioned before, was like a primary cinema battleground in the culture wars. For many of the self-serious critics at the time, the controversy and crowds of low-status evangelicals that drove the enormous box office success must have been like a major turnoff. Jonathan Rosenbaum's review is one of the laziest, most poorly conceived critical pieces I've ever read, absolutely chomping at the bit to dismiss the movie for any reason at all. It's genuinely discrediting of him as a film critic and any kind of cultural critic, really. Now we're kind of looking back on this moment 20 years on, and it's arguably still the most divisive film of the 21st century. Other often cited examples are today diminished in their controversy, or were not comparably famous, or like The Last Jedi or Ghostbusters 2016 were really just a proxy for somewhat unrelated culture war issues. Passion of the Christ and the reaction to it strikes at the heart of what you believe and beliefs held by billions worldwide. And not just Christians, also, obviously atheists, but also, as we'll get into a little bit, some of the other Abrahamic monotheistic religions. And yeah, so controversial is the Passion of the Christ, even to this day, to really address it. Two major complaints must be addressed first. And the first criticism that you'll hear is that the film is excessively violent. And this is kind of what Jonathan Rosenbaum hung the hat of his horrible critique on. This notion that, Christians should be ashamed to see their religion represented by such hideous violence. Now, the depiction of Jesus Christ's brutalization and execution is the central component of Passion of the Christ, and it is excruciating. We see Jesus flayed, pieces of his skin flying off, his body covered head to toe in blood and lacerations as he struggles to walk under the weight of the cross. Many have described it as a sadistic horror film or a work of exploitation cinema posing as a religious film. And it is deeply uncomfortable to watch. But these criticisms, they totally misunderstand the ultraviolence and the role that it plays here. Passion of the Christ isn't a horror film in the typical sense of the genre. We aren't asked to indulge in the violence, we're appalled by it, and the victim doesn't flee in terror. He accepts his fate and he forgives his tormentors. There's um, a profound reversal from the common horror formula there. Passion of the Christ requires of its audience kind of both an understanding of the core of Christian theology as well as how art functions beyond the immediacy of beauty and ugliness, and the way these two things interface in devotional art. The crucifixion is the actuating core of the Christian religion. Jesus Christ's suffering, humiliation, and death is the load that bears the entire weight of all human sin. Every transgression and wrongdoing, the thing that gives each of us the chance of redemption and the entrance into heaven despite our failings and our inability to abstain from sin and immorality, right? Without this sacrifice, we're doomed to hell. Like this is it. Like this core, if you believe in Christianity, this sacrifice bears the weight of every human sin and is like the one thing that protects us all from eternal damnation. Okay, so that is the locus of the force, the aesthetic force of the violence that's on display in this film, right? It has to be that profound. It has to be that disgusting and painful and torturous, because if it's not, then it it fails to bear the weight of the Christian message, which is really at its core, Christianity is about confronting suffering, like confronting suffering in the world. Um, yeah, but anyway, in the opening Gethsemane scene, during Christ's temptation by Satan, who alleges that no individual can bear the full burden of sin, he is depicted at his most human. Christ is fully human as well as fully divine, so he experiences the full spiritual and physical torment of shouldering all of human sin through crucifixion, as a mere man would. And this is the purpose of Passion of the Christ, to depict the enormity of this sacrifice and thereby impart the core redemptive message of Christianity in direct and affecting terms, right? This is a dramatization, this is an aestheticization of the very core of Christianity, the load that bears everything else. Okay? And that's why you can't just sort of, if you are willing to take devotional art as a on its own terms as a legitimate aesthetic expression, and if you're not, I mean, you're not even engaging with art at all, so you can just check out right now. But if you're willing to engage with it on its own terms, you have to contend with how this is directly um, in such forceful and powerful terms, realizing visually, aesthetically, the core of Christianity. The second complaint that you'll hear is this charge of anti-Semitism, right? In the lead up to the film's release, the then chairman of the Jewish advocacy group, the Anti-Defamation League, Abe Foxman, led a highly publicized campaign questioning the film and its author's attitude towards Jews and their relationship to Jesus Christ. This allegation is levied on the basis of Passion of the Christ's depiction of the Sanhedrin impelling the arrest and crucifixion of Jesus. This is exactly what the Gospels describe as well. The logically preceding charge that the New Testament, and therefore Christianity itself, is anti Semitic Like that is where this goes. And in fact, for example, this controversy has kind of bubbled up again in um, contemporary politics with this international Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism, um, calling the New Testament anti-Semitic, and that's been enshrined into law in America, and it creates this fracture where if you are a truly believing Christian, and then uh, the New Testament is called anti-Semitic. I mean, this is this is not this is a dangerous and problematic tension. And this question of is Christianity anti-Semitic is something that I can't possibly cover here. There's endless debates about this, and a lot of research and discussion on this and the relationship of Christianity to anti-Semitism and the history therein. But in short, I would say that Christianity, whether whether whatever you would say about anti-Semitism in Christianity, it's an inherently epistemologically legitimate framework for viewing the world. It's one of the most credible religions. It's the most prolific religion in the world. Um, and the Christian message has been essential in spreading even beliefs about anti-racism and the protection of the weak. Historically, there's a lot of research about how the massive spread of Christianity in the first millennium also constituted a moral revolution that um, led to people, uh, you know, uh, taking morality and the protection of the vulnerable and the weak and criticism of discrimination, etc., more seriously than it previously had been, in the brutal um, ages that had preceded. So, in short, I think whatever you are going to say about anti-Semitism and Christianity, uh, and there's legitimate arguments on both sides of that debate. Christianity is um, legitimate, and you can't just hand wave it away with this um, allegation of anti-Semitism. And once you arrive at that juncture, you have to say, like, okay, this is a religion with 2 billion adherents. For the vast majority of them, they don't see it in conflict with Judaism or the Jewish ethnicity. Um, and for the vast majority of them, Christianity, their religion, is a force that compels them towards anti-racism and towards humanist beliefs and practices, such as charity, opposing discrimination, and so on. So, you know, I think from a anyway, look. So to get to the specific critiques that are made in regard to the film, some critics kind of sorry, some critics allege that many of the villainous characters in Passion of the Christ are depicted as stereotypically Jewish, like with large noses or whatever the caricature is, which perpetuates anti-Semitism. But I don't find it to be stereotypical. It's archetypal rather than stereotypical. We can recognize that Jewish people may look a certain way. I don't think the Passion of the Christ depicts Jewish people as grotesque, right? And this depiction, which is archetypal rather than caricaturish, also extends to almost all of the sympathetic characters as well, like Mary, mother of Jesus, the apostles, Veronica, who wipes Jesus' face when he carries the cross. With the benefit of hindsight and recent high profile reminders of what explicit anti Semitism looks like, all these kind of criticisms about anti Semitism were largely unwarranted and totally counterproductive. The ADL instigating a campaign to brand a biblically accurate retelling of the crucifixion as anti Semitic probably did more to promote anti Semitism and specifically promote awareness of religious justifications for anti Semitism than the film ever could have done on its own, you know. And I would also go so far to say that I think, if you look at the stories of what prominent anti Semites say motivated them to get um, to fall down that rabbit hole, right? Like, for example, Kanye West talks about, you know, personal dealings with people who, Jewish people in his personal life, or Nick Fuentes talks about, you know, he was asking questions about Israel and supposedly got shut down by um, a woman at Daily Wire called Cassie Dillon. Like, often these kinds of extremely forthright and defensive posture from these Jewish advocacy groups like the ADL, where they're saying, "Oh, you know, um, uh, we're not going to tolerate a biblically accurate depiction of of the crucifixion, of the stories of the Gospels, because you have to prostrate yourself. You have to have a message saying no anti-Semitism in there." These kinds of very forward and forthright um, attacks on anti-Semitism, perceived anti-Semitism, often backfire and lead to people falling down the rabbit hole and being pushed into this kind of bigotry. And I think it's seems obvious in retrospect that there's a substantial chance that this kind of response to the Passion of the Christ may have catalyzed Mel Gibson to start looking at the world in that way. Um, and that's not to say I'm not trying to do some kind of victim blaming or whatever, but you just have to be a little bit, um, a little bit, a little bit balanced and a little bit realistic about, you know, is calling the New Testament anti-Semitic going to decrease anti-Semitism or increase it, right? I think it's incredibly foolish and it's counterproductive. But anyway, these fervent objections aside, few will deny the power of the Passion of the Christ. Even the haters, right? Even the haters will say this is a very powerful film, just that maybe it disgusts me, or it's anti-Semitic or whatever. It's really a spiritual ordeal that lays siege to the viewer, gradually accumulating power, majesty, and horror. Gibson locks audiences in with an emotionally resonant close to medium distance cinema verite approach, framing us from the vantage point of collective Christianity, all humbled and powerless beneath the cross, yet frequently stepping out into the mode of great religious paintings with raw and singular force. The anamorphic photography and epic scale of the production superficially mirrors like 1950s and 60s biblical epics, like you know, the greatest story ever told or whatever, but or the Ten Commandments, but the fluid spatial direction strips away the characteristic artifice and detachment of those films while still irradiating viewers with powerful imagery, even in its most serene moments. Gibson has cited the New Hollywood era and people like Sam Peckinpah among his greatest creative inspirations, and few films this century better exemplify that kind of countercultural meets mass cultural energy and American New Wave directorial philosophy of the New Hollywood period better than Passion of the Christ in form and in content, while also organically congruent to the aesthetic and religious aims of the film. The gritty violence and the masculinization of Jesus Christ are unmistakably drawn from Gibson's preoccupation with that kind of filmmaking. And, you know, one of the really significant aspects of Passion of the Christ that I feel like goes unsaid is that it's perhaps the most influential work in living memory when it comes to the aestheticization of the life of Christ. And I don't just mean like a film or, a TV series. I'm talking about anything. Literally any form of cultural expression, any form of art or whatever you want to call it. It's the most critical in living memory. The visual language of Passion of the Christ has implanted itself on Christian culture, superseding the wooden and detached visual depictions of Christ on the cross that sought kind of reverent distance in fear of treading the territory of graven images. And this is actually quite a deep well that this aesthetic conundrum extends back a millennium or more in church history. Few Christian paintings and devotional artworks sought to aestheticize the true brutality of the crucifixion, and perhaps none in as graphic a way as Gibson. One of the strongest image making moments is the transposition of the Stations of the Cross into a fully temporally realized sequence that preserves the integrity of each station in stark and recognizable terms while building a coherent sequence that naturally progresses through them. Like, it's one thing to see these. I mean, if you are from a Catholic background and you've kind of seen these images um, in their sort of static and separated forms in a church, it's actually quite to have an a fluid visual continuity that that doesn't have this overly labored editing to go to pass through this sequence of images is actually a real work of um, uh, image making and visual um, drawing out forms from millennia old um, aesthetic traditions into um, the fully realized temporality of a a modern film, which is really impressive. Um, for those who appreciate that aesthetic lineage, it'll doubtless be deeply impactful. In later scenes, as the torture grows more brutal, Christ's tormentors grow agitated, vacillating from anger to insecurity. They seek security and catharsis in increased violence and the finality of the crucifixion, but the self doubt only grows, while his forgiveness and compassion remain absolute and unshaken. Gibson captures Christ in the most powerful and godlike terms in his final moments on the cross: immobile, dying, but imminent over everything, such that his assailants are rendered impotent and defiant, like the sinner who removes himself from the infinite glory of God's kingdom for the fleeting corruption of worldly pleasures. Over the course of the film, the visual language accelerates with faster, whirling camera work. With Jesus' death, this building pressure explodes into apocalypse. A digital drop of water falls through the camera lens. The earth quakes and the devil screams in hell. Throughout the film, there's this incredible, luminous aesthetic work by cinematographer Caleb Deschanel, who cited work by Caravaggio and Gericault as his inspiration. The Passion of the Christ plays to his strengths as a master of lighting and soft texture, which you can also see in his really early collaborations with Carol Ballard. Caleb Deschanel is quite an interesting American filmmaker who came along at the end of the um, new Hollywood period, which is doubtless why he's attractive or was attractive to Gibson at the time. And he did that film by Hal Ashby with Peter Sellers, which the name escapes me, something about nothing, and and the Black Stallion in the same year. Just these kinds of nuanced, lighting focused cinematography that was really perfect to adapt the figurative style of religious painting into something really forceful and expressive on the screen. This, it has this primordial earth, sky, color, and tone mixture, which is deeply immersive and employed distinctively in a calculated progression that accentuates the stages of the gospel narrative. And you also get this kind of night to day and dawn and then night again, and obviously the uh the atmospheric or temporal changes that happen when the crucifixion occurs, of course, figure into that as well. Now, there are a few flaws that still stand out in the Passion of the Christ. The Aramaic is at times awkwardly performed by the cast, none of whom were native speakers. Infamously, it's been argued that the Aramaic may not even be real legible Aramaic and might just be like a failed modern pidgin version anyway. The androgynous Satan who tempts Christ and torments Christ over the course of the film is designed in this kind of way to capture the seductive and disgusting nature of sin, in my opinion, doesn't really work and sticks out like a sore thumb. That's a difficult. I appreciate what he was going for there, but I think it's a difficult balance to meet, and ultimately, this kind of snake-like, Voldemort type character with a feminine face is slightly feminine face is I think he could have struck a better balance, particularly with how the character of Satan meshes with the naturalized elements of the rest of the setting. Um, there are a few disjointed edits and some poorly conceived slow motion scenes, particularly in the opening scene at Gethsemane. It's really a bit overused there. Though mostly used to great effect, the flickering candlelight and oriental score feel a bit prestige TV at times. But, in aggregate, this is a great and immersive piece of popular cinema, a functional dramatization of the central event in Christianity, and an exploration of the iconography surrounding Christ's sacrifice. It has also proved to be, like I said at the onset of this, a founding work in the American Christian slash conservative alternative cultural stream. You can think about, whatever Daily Wire Plus today, the God's Not Dead films, and this kind of strand that is separated from the mainstream and proved to have um, an enduring staying power, whatever one thinks of its aesthetic or artistic merits. Um, yeah, and the Passion of the Christ's success both financially and artistically legitimized this dramatic expansion of the conservative Christian media enterprises that existed in a smaller way beforehand, but have only grown massively since then, and have and the controversy surrounding Passion of the Christ and other things in the cultural ecosystem during the 2000s only served to legitimize the sense of embattlement and countercultural positioning endemic to modern day conservatism, at least American centric, or maybe even Anglosphere conservatism. In the current decade, the crowning jewel of the alternative conservative Christian ecosystem is probably Daily Wire Plus, which was able to self produce, you know, a semi competent facsimile of a David Zucker film with the subtlety of a Ben Shapiro owns with facts and logic compilation in Lady Bowlers, and a viral Michael Moore style meme documentary with what is a woman. These are while I don't agree with people who want to say that these are like totally lacking in merit, where Bowling for Columbine is a subtle work of genius. I think they're both basically just the same kettle of fish. The results are less than inspiring. If only the artistic lessons had been learned from The Passion of the Christ as well as the financial ones. One can only hope that Mel can save us with Passion 2, The Resurrection. Supposedly, it was supposed to come this year, but it's been pushed back so many times already um, that, and with Easter already in the receding uh, receding in the rearview mirror now. I think it's as good as gone. But if the production difficulty is anything to go by, hopefully this one could be just as good as the first one. So, yeah, that's kind of my reflection, my thought, um, my feelings in retrospect on the Passion of the Christ. Um, it's a very significant and interesting work of its time. Um, one of the central and most accomplished works of devotional art ever um, put forth in this century, this millennia. Um, and the controversy just speaks to its accomplishment and its significance. And I hope that with the 20th anniversary, it can warrant some revisiting, um, something of a return to prominence, perhaps, of the Passion of the Christ. Maybe it's already happened to some degree. Um, but yeah, that's my thoughts, and hope you enjoyed. See you later.